Hi everybody, my name is Dr. Benita Kane and I'm one of the co-founders of South Asian Heritage Month.
Hi everyone, I'm Rahima Khatun Malik and I'm a secondary school teacher who's helped to put together the Schools Toolkit.
Thanks Rahima. So we are over the next 20 or 30 minutes going to run through the toolkit, which has been created especially for South Asian Heritage Month 2022, where we have our Journeys of Empire theme, which will capture two particularly big events, the Partition of India 75th anniversary and also 50th anniversary of the Ugandan expulsion of Indians by Idi Amin. This particular toolkit is going to focus more on partition and we're going to talk you through. So just to kick off, we have a message from myself and Jasbir Singh, the other co-founder for the pupils, and then a message from Mrs. Malik.
Just a quick message that you can read when you get the hands on the toolkit.
I think the important thing is this isn't designed to be a catch-all, is it? It's more focused on the theme and other resources are available.
Yeah, just to make life a bit easier because time is precious and at least this way you have something substantial to go through.
Our motto for South Asian Heritage Month is celebrate, commemorate, educate. So that's a good framework for planning any lessons or any activities with children. A brief sort of history of South Asian Heritage Month. It was launched for the first time in 2020. There is a video and a poem that was written here for our original launch in 2020. It's probably more suited for secondary school children. It's very short and it might stimulate some conversation as well in the classroom. For primary school children, our launch video for 2021 would be more appropriate because it explains things a lot more simply at the level of it. It's a children's story, if you like. Again, a very short video, and the links to directly watch those videos are on the slides. As I've mentioned, our Journeys of Empire theme can capture a huge number of different aspects of South Asian identity, not only in Britain, but abroad as well. And so there is scope to include people who are not from South Asian heritage in these conversations and think about migration more broadly.
Absolutely, yeah. So here's a little bit of a quiz to see if people know the locations of these countries in South Asia. And it's revealed on the next slide.
And the fact that there's 8 countries in South Asia, I think that comes as a bit of a surprise to many people. We give a bit of background here about what British India meant and how it relates to all of those 8 modern day South Asian countries. Oops.
And the Mughal so this slide was added in for a bit more history. It's not all encompassing. It's literally got just 6 Mughal emperors on there that were there until 1707. So there's a link that you can use for further information, but it's just a little bit of a insight of how it all started off before the Europeans arrived, what things were like.
Absolutely. I think it's really important to remember that the history of Britain and South Asia started a long time before 1947, which is kind of what we focus on. And of course, there was Shah Jahan, who famously built the Taj Mahal for his wife there. Also a nice kind of talking point for the children.
And here's just a little bit of a introduction on the Britain and the British arriving in India and why they were, what fueled their journey thousands of miles away from the homeland.
And also the kind of birth of the British Empire, because I think a lot of people still don't know about the rise of the East India Company, and it was all about trade.
Yeah.
And again, it's really fascinating history that is relevant to everybody in modern day Britain.
And here it links onto how what we call the British Raj, how that gained prominence, and Queen Victoria's impact on India at that time as well, because even till now there's a memorial in Kolkata.
Yeah, and actually the kind of the Sepoy Rebellion or the Indian Mutiny or the First War of Independence, depending on which perspective you're looking at, whether you're looking at the perspective of the colonizers or the colonized, people called it different things. And again, that's kind of quite a good topic of debate or discussion with the pupils. Was it a mutiny? Was it a rebellion? Or was it a war of independence? Okay, moving on.
And there's another slide here that's a very important event, and I actually didn't know about it until this toolkit. And it just goes to show, you know, like I've been in the schools in the 90s and early 2000s, and I didn't learn about it at all. So hopefully better late than never, but we really want to ensure that all our young children in schools, at primary schools and secondary schools, can learn this part of British history.
Yeah, and for me as well, Rahima, it was interesting because I think people talk about this 200 years of rule of the British over India, but actually it wasn't quite that way, because at that time of the start of that period, 100 years before the British Raj formally became established, that's actually when the battles took place and the process of colonization started. And this was a really important battle, wasn't it, when these very famous British colonial figures, Robert Clive and Admiral Charles Watson, took over Bengal, which was kind of the richest province at that point. And again, I didn't know much about this at all either. And it's been really great to learn about it.
Yeah, and just to hear that, that connection, being Bengali, just linking with the word Bengal. I know it's a very big region, and just understanding how rich it was, and how that's obviously wealth that's been accrued and then moved through the lands and come to people that are born where we are right now, and that link is quite mind-blowing.
Absolutely. And then we've sort of touched upon the way that the British governed in India, and we won't go into this in detail, but it touches upon that commonly described divide and rule policy, which again is quite an interesting topic to discuss.
I mean, that we now understand that can be a dangerous mindset as well.
Absolutely. Do you want to talk about this one?
At first I didn't realize the different pink and yellow or orange regions were distinctly different. The key explains it and it goes into it a bit more, but the princely states and in yellow and how it's they are literally side by side merged. It's not as if it's clear sections. It's all a bit of a mix, really.
Yeah, so I guess the yellow part is the bits that were under direct British rule, and the pink states or provinces were still had their native rulers, but they were still sort of answerable to the British through these sort of treaty relations. And again, it's something I don't know an awful lot about, but it surprised me to know that Britain didn't actually directly rule all of India.
All of it,
a little bit more about the way that the Indians were then divided along religious lines through various policies.
And even in many of the incidents that I've seen in Who Do You Think You Are, some other episodes as well, you have I just didn't remember people saying, we got along fine, we celebrated each other's festivals, we had lovely neighbors and communities, and then this division that comes across, it's really disheartening to know that it was deliberate. So
absolutely. And I think for me as well, when I won't go into my story, but it all was triggered by a documentary which was made by the same people who do Who Do You Think You Are, where I went and traced my family's history and footsteps at the time of partition. And that's the big thing that I never knew. I didn't know that these communities lived side by side for generations. Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims ate together, drank together, celebrated together. And it was post partition that the divisions really sort of set in, but it was quite deliberately done in that way. And I think growing up, I very much heard all the hatred between the communities and the division, but I didn't get that narrative of one shared heritage, which is kind of what we're trying to come back to with South Asian Heritage Month. But actually, South Asia is really diverse and made up of loads of different countries and people and religions, and it's beautifully diverse. But actually, at one time, it was one shared sort of humanity, and that's kind of what we want to get back to. And I think it's just a really nice message to think about with the children as well.
Absolutely. And then it moves on to a bit more about the British Raj, and would you say like the hierarchy and the different, societies living side by side?
I think the enormous wealth of the Raj was quite shocking when I found out about just how rich the Raj were, and then how and how the Indian people were subjugated, were often the servants, and weren't allowed to live in the same circumstances as the British Raj. And what another kind of quite interesting fact about this is that the image that people from South Asia had of the British was that it was all opulent and rich, and then when people migrated and came here in the 60s and 70s, and they came here and went, oh, there's poor people in Britain, and there was just this real contrast between the rich and the poor, but it didn't also reflect what was happening in Britain, which was really interesting.
Absolutely, like the existence of workhouses and the aristocracy, and all of that divide. If anyone's watched say Downton Abbey or something like that, they'll know there was a big divide, and it wasn't all opulence at all. And the weather, there's a very, very big difference of the weather for Britain and for British India. There's a very, very different climates.
Absolutely. And of course the British had generations that lived there, of course, that British people, part of the British Raj, who'd never been to Britain, and were as Indian by birthright as anyone else, who then got thrust back to Britain after partition and had a really kind of huge experience of trying to adjust to that. So there's lots and lots of stuff to explore around this, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is just the one slide, but behind there's so much you could put in and do.
And then there were, it wasn't that everybody was happy with British rule all the time. There were a lot of rebellions and uprisings, and of course one of the most famous kind of proponents of independence of India was Mahatma Gandhi. And so there's an opportunity here to talk about him and the peaceful sort of nationwide movement against the British, fighting for independence. And a lot of the children might have heard of Mahatma Gandhi but not really know much about what he stood for.
And it wasn't just on his front. It was there was an alliance and an allyship in the same sentiment for people who wanted to have the freedom away from the British control, that were Muslim too. So it wasn't just Hindus, it wasn't just Sikhs, it wasn't just Muslims, it was everyone combined, wanting that freedom, instead of that control.
And then there's the incredible story of partition and how it happened. And it's just astonishing when you actually get into and you see the timeline that, so this talks a little bit about the kind of the lead up to that and how the different political leaders had different visions. But it was actually the last British Viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, who announced that the division was going to happen on the 3rd of June, and then it was done and dusted less than 10 weeks later. It's just astonishing. And there is so much rich content to discuss around that timeline.
Absolutely. And it's 10 weeks, what type of time frame is that? in hindsight, we know that 10 weeks is nothing really. And, you know, there's a lot of prominence, and rightly so, of, you know, both world wars in our history and our schemes of work and our curriculum. But this happened and is such an important aspect. Yes, it happened in a different part of the world, but it was still part of British history. And, you know, I've never been taught about it.
Absolutely, and I was the same. Came through the British schooling system and never learnt about this. I mean, it was an absolutely enormous event in 20th century history, and the reason I exist in the UK is because of this stuff, and the reason, you know, what happened to my family and what happened to my granddad, and it was all decisions that were made in the British Parliament in 1947 that has basically shaped my entire existence, which is kind of a bit mind-blowing when you think about it.
Yeah. And you know, we're a significant part of the demographic of this country. 1 in 20 are at least affected, you know, and that's going to increase because, you know, South Asia is such a big country. It's not just a small group of people, you know.
Absolutely, and globally, I think it's 1 in 4 people that can trace their heritage back to South Asia. I mean, those of us with that history, this is hugely important for, you know, literally billions across the globe, and something that isn't really talked about an awful lot. Okay, there's a slide about the Radcliffe line, which is Cyril Radcliffe, who was the barrister who was sort of commissioned to squiggle the 2 lines of division and where East and West Pakistan would be. And this is something I didn't know, but a couple of days after partition, apparently he left and never revisited and destroyed all of his notes. It was quite a surprising fact, and again, maybe a point of discussion of why do we think he did that. So this is someone who's never been to India before.
It's I'm just a bit speechless.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say, this 20-minute video, I mean, it focuses entirely on the Punjab, and not the sort of division of Bengal, but it's a really, really good 20-minute film on how it happened and how it impacted on the communities. And then at the end of that video, there is actually a couple of school classes that are talking to each other. And I think it's a really good one, for teachers to try and understand a bit more about how this impacted on communities, but I think it's a nice one to show the pupils if there's time as well.
I think so too, yeah.
So this was sort of the largest mass migration of humans in history. I mean, 50 million people displaced in the aftermath of partition, a lot of violence, a lot of bloodshed, people having to literally get up and leave and take the following. And I think it really opens up that narrative about forced migration.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this image is one of the child-friendly images we could put on this slide. You know, this is by no way an actual like overall picture, but just a visual would help, and that's why it's there. But you know, there was a lot more death and bloodshed, and you know, people just going through unspeakable things. I think there's still some people that, you know, have relatives that have been through that and they can't speak about it all, because it's traumatic.
Absolutely, and that trauma does get passed down the generations as well. And certainly people sometimes think, well, how do all these peaceful communities just suddenly start killing each other, and what was that all about? And it's really complex, and there were no winners and there were no losers. Everyone lost in this. There was
absolutely
nobody came out of this looking good, and there's lots of complex reasons behind the violence, which I don't think really teachers can get into or should get into. But I think it's also important to know that there were stories, like my personal story of my family, where a Muslim family risked their own lives to shelter my Hindu family and get them out of the way of violence. They almost certainly would have been killed without that. And there were people who were jubilant about independence. They've been fighting for it for a very long time. There are people who wanted the independent homeland of Pakistan and independence in India. I just don't think anyone could have predicted what would happen and how. And the British very much sort of stood by and retreated and left rather than sticking around to sort things out.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a bit, I think reckless is the word that comes to mind. But again, this is an overview. It's got the text in the toolkit has been checked through, and you'll see that in the acknowledgements we've had a fair few eyes on this toolkit. So by no means doesn't mean that any teacher has to be an expert to get this delivered to schools. Just this is the basics to kind of start off with.
And just as a complete transparency, I am no expert in this. I'm learning along with everybody else. Yeah,
absolutely, same here. And I think it moves on to another informative video that, again, it was something like this. Secondary school children can, I think they can open up their minds, and that discussion of, the impact and, it's what, why it happened, and just have a bit more insight. So instead of it just being slides to read, there's also videos to watch.
This is just a slide to show and to talk about the Independence Days and where the borders now lie, and just a note to just highlight that East Pakistan actually didn't become Bangladesh until 1971. Again, a piece of history I didn't really know anything about, but it was another really bloody war with millions of people who died. Again, don't think we need to go into that with children, but that is in my brother's lifetime. It's quite it's quite crazy, I think, how recent this history is and how little we know about it. And it's all that sort of it's all of that hangover from 1947.
And that's why last year, it being the 50th year for Bangladesh independence, and 2021, it was a massive milestone. But then I think some of us are a bit shocked. Wait, it's only 50 years? And then it just another discussion point, and then it prompted a lot of us to question our parents. Hold on a minute, you were this age at that time, can you tell me what happened? And those of them who are comfortable to speak about it, I think they get a bit gobsmacked, to realize we're inquisitive, but of course you want to know what they went through and what happened and what they remember, because everyone's story is part of history, not just one narrative.
Absolutely. And I'm just conscious that I said we'd do 20-30 minutes, and we could talk about this all day, I think, Rahima, couldn't we?
I think so.
Yeah, right. So we're going to have to speed up a little bit.
Speed up, yeah, absolutely.
So 75th, this is 75th year, I think we've had that home. This is a little bit about the significance of the dates of South Asian Heritage Month. And I think the point of this slide, they are very, very British dates. They relate to King George the Sixth and Sir Cyril Radcliffe.
Yeah.
This is a graphic that was created in an event that took place in Parliament 2018, and this was really around trying to capture why remembering partition is important today. Yeah. And again, I could talk about this graphic for many hours. I think
we talked about it for a while when we first came. Put that in. Absolutely.
It absolutely captures a lot of stuff we've already talked about, and again, it could be a really good talking point for pupils. Go on, do you want to quickly go through this one?
Yeah, so again, linking it back to British history, the British Nationality Act of 1948. Now, how come, we're now here? Okay, we know that the British were there, and that's why, but what prompted that? And it is to rebuild the country, especially we've got the NHS and so many important infrastructures and industries that needed workers.
Absolutely. And I think the other important bit on this slide was, as part of the whole conversations around independence and in the lead up to independence, there's hundreds of thousands of South Asian soldiers who fought along the British in World War II, and of course the 1.5 or 2 million that fought in World War I as well. So South Asia was a huge part of the war effort. And then after Britain lost a lot of its workforce in the war and they had acute labour shortages, and then it was the Commonwealth folk came over as citizens to fill those posts, people like my dad who then worked in the NHS. And again, people aren't really aware, and it's the Windrush generation as well, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's, you know, Commonwealth is far wider and larger than just British India, and that can be a discussion point to kind of make these connections and links. Well, actually, you know, we've got all these pockets of migrants coming over because Britain wanted them, and then the treatment was atrocious.
A little bit about just expanding on that 1 in 20 people in the UK, and just to think that pupils might want to explore their own families' migration stories. It might be something they've never thought of before and never discussed. Or if they're not from South Asia or they don't know anyone South Asian, can they find any influences in their local towns or cities? I mean, I was quite staggered to find how much South Asian influence there is in Manchester. And you could do a little tour actually and look at all the trading posts and the cotton, and there was all sorts of stuff. So that could be quite a fun activity, quite interesting. A little bit about how South Asian has impacted on multiple things in the UK. And again, this is just topics.
The list could go on.
Exactly, yeah, that people could discuss. Just about how the month came about, I won't sort of dwell on that, and a message from Anita Rani, who is our founding patron. Oops, we don't need to play that now. Links to our website, a sort of fun cooking idea, which was done by Nadia from Bake Off. I'm just wondering, Rahima, whether we should finish there and then perhaps do the henna enrichment and the competition on a separate video.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So just to finish off on this video, we'll go into this in a little bit more detail separately. And then we've got a postcard competition to tell you about with some examples, but we'll whiz through that on a different video. And then finally, just some further resources, some really brilliant stuff here, isn't there?
Yeah, loads. Absolutely loads.
So we've got the Partition Education Group website here. We've got various little videos which could stimulate conversations. There's the Amritsar Partition Museum, the CBBC News Round piece, which was absolutely fantastic, really good for primary school kids.
Yeah.
The Borders video. And then, of course, the documentary that I was part of as well. Again, that's 2 hours worth of viewings. That might be more for homework, or if people are interested, just to signpost them to that, but they are on YouTube. But thank you very much. And I think all that remains to be said is that we are delighted that you're watching this, if you are, and thank you. If you want any information, we've got a website, we've got the email, all the links to our social media channels are here, and these are our official hashtags. South Asian Heritage Month, and of course the Our Stories Matter hashtag is a great one as well, because that is just about people telling their stories and sharing them on social media with that hashtag. So that's all I was going to say. Any final words from you, Rahima?
Just thank you for watching this much of the video, and good luck with your projects and ideas that you do in your schools.